Of the most significant consequences of the discovery of the New World and the two sides of the world becoming one was the rise of the new global economy. Now, the first global economy, and it really was the first global economy because this was the first time that the New World and the Old World had traded extensively with one another. Societies and civilizations in the Old World had traded with each other for a very long time, but that's not a truly global economy. And this new global economy not only shifted trade routes, and so instead of the Muslim world being the world in which all trade routes run through, the trade that developed between China and Europe, instead it's going to shift over to the Atlantic Ocean, and really this benefits Europe the most. In this first global trade, it's going to be those items that are very high in value but relatively low in weight and volume, luxury items. And so we've mentioned some of these before. Things like silver coming out of the New World will be part of the new global economy. Sugar that is being planted increasingly in the Caribbean, the West Indies, and Brazil. You have spices with the Portuguese and the East. And lastly, the last leg of this economic system is the new slave system or the slave trade that arises, specifically the slave trade in the Atlantic. And so we're going to focus on the development of the transatlantic slave trade and what role did it have in the initial global economy. What is central to this is sugar, and specifically geographically, the area of Brazil and the Caribbean, which most slaves will end up. Now, initially it was Portugal that brought the very first slaves to the New World working on sugar plantations. But soon, around the 1600s or so, the Dutch are going to end up taking over that, using joint stock companies in their parliamentary system, in which they're much better at doing business and economically thriving than the Portuguese were. And so the Dutch West India Company is one of these joint stock companies that will take over the slave trade from Portugal. And so it's Brazil and the West Indies in which 4 million slaves will be brought during the course of this transatlantic slave trade. To give a little bit of perspective, that is 10 times the amount that are to the British colonies. And so when we look at the transatlantic slave trade in a more global context, what we realize is that, it's true there were a number of slaves brought to the British colonies in the Americas, but over 95% of the slaves arrive in other places in the New World, including Brazil and the West Indies. Now, a lot of other nations will participate in this, and so you have sugar colonies that are heavily reliant on slave labor: Spanish Cuba, French Haiti, British Jamaica, et cetera, et cetera. What was this, what was slavery like? Well, in the West Indies, on those sugar plantations, it was, in many cases, a ratio of 10 slaves for every one free individual. Islands like Jamaica, 90% of the people who lived in Jamaica were slaves. Sugar was especially physically taxing. Labor gangs worked from sun up till sundown. It was very, very brutal labor, more difficult than tobacco or cotton labor. Sugar is really one of those trade goods. And because it was so physically demanding in the West Indies, men outnumbered women. And so this has a couple of consequences. First and foremost, it means that in those slave colonies in the West Indies, deaths outnumber births. It's simply a demographic issue. There's not enough men and women to reproduce. And so because more people are dying than are being born, the life expectancy was only 23 years old for a male African slave in some of these sugar colonies. They're literally being worked to death. It's a high mortality, low fertility environment. And so what that translates into, if there are more men than women, if there are more deaths than births, if you are worked to death at the age of 23, it means that to continue sugar production, you have to continuously import more and more slaves. And so that's why you see some of these ridiculous numbers. By the end of it, by the 1800s, you've had perhaps 15 to 20 million people that have been taken from Africa and sent to the New World. And this is being facilitated by a new economic system. You have the dying out of an old economic theory, and and the rise of a new one, and that is capitalism and mercantilism. Mercantilism was an economic theory that believed the amount of wealth in the world was finite, and that each country had a slice of the pie in terms of wealth, and that if one country got richer, that had to mean that another country got poorer. And what mercantilism translated to was that countries refused to trade with each other, and colonies were only forced to trade with their mother countries. So, in other words, sugar from British Jamaica could only go to Great Britain, and sugar from Haiti could only go to France, and the two sides were unwilling to trade with each other. You see laws like the Navigation Acts, which are going to force the English colonies specifically to only trade with Great Britain. In fact, these ideas of mercantilism are partly what inspires the American Revolution, where the American colonists or English colonists, I should say, are not very happy with being told who they can and cannot trade with. But you have a lot of the institutions established at this time, which will be the foundations for a capitalist system, which emerges a little bit later. Banks, stock exchanges, joint stock companies, which are essentially the predecessors of corporations. Now, capitalism as an idea and capitalism as an economic practice is not going to come until a little bit later. Essentially, where capitalism differs from mercantilism is that capitalism believes that government should have the least amount of intervention in the economy as possible. Capitalism believes that if one country becomes more wealthy, then it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody else becomes less wealthy. Capitalism believes that the pie can grow, and that when two countries trade with each other, they both become more wealthy because they both get what they want. So it's a different idea. In capitalism, there are no laws like the Navigation Acts. You are free to trade with whoever you want. You don't have government monopolies of certain companies, which you do find during this era. Now, in terms of global trade and silver, sugar, slaves, and spices, it is the Dutch East India Company and the spice trade that is by far the most profitable of these joint stock companies. It is the most powerful and richest business ever to have existed. The Dutch East India Company, to give you an idea, is permitted by the Dutch government to have their own court system and laws. The Dutch East India Company has their own army, and the Dutch East India Company is granted a monopoly by the Netherlands, meaning no other Dutch company can compete with them. And that was partially inspired by the fact that you wanted to compete with the other countries. The Netherlands wanted to make sure that they could dominate trade over England, over Spain, and over France at that time. So, imagine today, a company with its own army, just exactly how profitable it can be. And that's one of the reasons why the Dutch East India Company and the spice trade was incredibly profitable. Now, focusing on the Atlantic Ocean, the trade that developed there is known as the triangular trade. And so you had each leg of the trade, North America, Europe, and Africa, each providing materials to the other. And so raw materials came from the Americas, went to Europe. Europe produced manufactured goods, sent them to Africa, and Africa provided slaves to the New World. And so the economies of all these sides are linked. The trip that slaves took across the Atlantic Ocean is known as the Middle Passage, and is perhaps one of the most horrific experiences that any person has gone through in the history of the world. Some of these conditions on the ships were conditions where people were crammed into very closed-off areas. People were chained down by their neck. Disease was rampant. And death rates of just the trip across was perhaps as high as 25%. Now, in regards to the slave trade, a couple of other things to mention. First and foremost, slavery had existed in Africa and in the Old World prior to Europeans arriving. In fact, slavery is nearly a human universal across civilizations over time. Even the Greeks and the Romans had practiced it. What's different in the transatlantic slave trade in the years between 1500 and 1800 is, first and foremost, the direction of the slave trade. and the extent to which the slave trade goes, is simply the sheer number of people that are involved in it. And so prior to European exploration and prior to the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, the slave trade in Africa previously had revolved around the Islamic world. And so you had parts of northern Africa that were controlled by the Ottoman Empire that were linked with trade to the Middle East. Historically speaking, sugar was grown in the Middle East, and so slaves were brought not just from Africa, but from all around. In fact, the English word slave comes from Slavic, because much of the Ottomans and some of the rulers in the Middle East previously had taken slaves from Eastern Europe and used them on sugar plantations. But sub-Saharan Africa will be linked to the Muslim world via trade routes across the Saharan desert, and those links between sub-Saharan Africa and the Muslim world date back to the 700s or 800s. And so, Islam was introduced to Western Africa at a very, very early time, and most slaves that were traded most typically went north. You also have in Eastern Africa the Swahili city-states, which are also linked to the Muslim trading world. And so the slave trade prior to European arrival was much less in number. It differed in some ways. Slaves were not considered just mere property. You could essentially assimilate into the family that you were enslaved with, and you found yourself becoming enslaved in pretty much one of three ways. First was not being able to pay your debts, and so if you weren't able to pay your debt, you could be enslaved. If you committed a crime, you could be enslaved, and probably most frequently is that when you were on the battlefield and surrendered, if you were captured POW, you could be enslaved as well. And so one of the ways that the slave trade facilitates is that, well, African tribal leaders will conduct war against their neighbors, capture a number of POWs, sell them to the Europeans. And one of the things that Europeans provide is, the latest and greatest weapons technology. So now you have guns to go out and go to war against your tribal neighbors, capture more slaves, get more guns, and the snowball rolls downhill. Now, some of these West African empires, there had existed some empires in Western Africa prior to European arrival. The Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, and most recently the Songhai Empire, which were very sophisticated empires, advanced civilizations, taxation systems, armies, etc., etc. But the Songhai Empire is going to prove unable to resist encroachment from Europeans, mostly because of the technological advances. And so it's raiders from the north, Morocco, that will be able to conquer the Songhai using firearms and weapons. And so by the time the first Portuguese explorers arrive, Western Africa is no longer ruled by these centralized African empires, but rather are a confederation of smaller states. And that makes it a little bit easier to exploit, and explains why there's so much conflict in Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans.